The stench of the concrete cell, a stale blend of fear, disinfectant, and iron, was the only constant in their lives. Outside, the world was fracturing, distant explosions rattled the corrugated roof above their heads. But inside, they remained huddled, a collective of broken spirits. They understood the sound of distant war not as a prelude to freedom, but as the final, terrifying measure of cleanup. In a compound hidden deep in the outskirts of Manila, they knew that when the end came, their captors would not retreat, they would simply eliminate the evidence. They know the end is coming, but do you know what happens next? Subscribe now. They gripped their thin, stained blankets tighter, trying to absorb some warmth from the adjacent bodies. They had stopped talking hours ago, the silence more terrifying than the usual shrieks and commands. They recognized this silence, it was the void preceding the final, cold order. They pressed together, their breathing shallow and frantic, each anticipating the inevitable death that would finally release them. A sudden, deafening crunch ripped through the silence, the sound of reinforced metal buckling and tearing. The compound wall had been breached. Shouts in an aggressive, unfamiliar language echoed across the yard. It wasn't the guttural Japanese they knew, it was sharp, loud, and utterly foreign. American. A wave of collective panic seized them. They scrambled, some attempting to claw their way under the collapsing beds, others simply giving up, sinking to the floor in catatonic despair. The women in the back corner, driven by a flicker of desperate, shared survival instinct, pressed themselves against the damp concrete, listening as heavy, unfamiliar boots pounded past their door. The door flew inward with a violent crash. Standing silhouetted against the blinding afternoon sun were men unlike any soldier they had ever seen. They were impossibly large, dressed in heavy, foreign fatigues, holding formidable weapons. Legends had been whispered among them, legends of American savagery and vengeance, and they believed this was the moment those tales came true. But the officer who stepped in first, a broad-shouldered man with the rank of captain, carried an aura of stern, cold authority, not rage. He scanned the room of terrified, malnourished women, his face impassive. He barked something in English, then nodded to a slight, younger soldier behind him, the medic. This young man stepped forward, eyes lowered in a gesture of profound respect that shocked them instantly. "We are Americans," the young soldier said, his Japanese heavily accented but deliberate. "You are safe. The Japanese soldiers, they are gone. You are free." The word free hung in the air, a beautiful lie they couldn't possibly accept. They watched as the officer stepped over debris and moved to one of their former guards, who was already on the ground, his wrists bound with white plastic ties. The officer nudged the bound guard with his boot, the man whimpered. This was their first profound shock. The Americans treated their enemies not with frantic revenge, but with cold, orderly detention. They simply processed them, devoid of emotion. The officer looked back at the terrified collective. His gaze was distant, yet held a flicker of unfamiliar sympathy. He spoke again in English, and the young soldier translated. "We are moving you out. Now. We have a place for you to rest. You will be safe there." They remained rooted to the spot. Safety was an extinct concept. Every past show of kindness had been a cruel trap. They were convinced this was simply the prelude to a more insidious form of captivity. It was one of the older women, a former nurse, who finally spoke for them all, her voice brittle. "Where are you taking us?" The officer waited patiently for the translation, then pointed toward the gaping hole in the compound wall. "Out of here. To a place where you will be treated like human beings again." This was their second shock. The offer wasn't a new cage, it was the terrifying gift of dignity. It felt like a deliberate taunt. Yet, someone had to test this reality. One of them, the youngest but strongest, stood up slowly, her legs shaking beneath the thin cotton dress. The young American medic rushed forward, but stopped abruptly, holding his hands up in a gesture of non-threat. He didn't touch them. He just waited, his respect a heavy, palpable force. That woman took her first deliberate step toward the light in years. They reached the broken wall and stepped outside into the blinding sunlight. The scene was chaos, but organized. American soldiers moved with professional purpose. The officer approached, holding out a large, military-issue water canteen. He offered it in silence. They hesitated, then cautiously took a sip. The water was cool, clean. They realized, with sickening clarity, that they were no longer a commodity to be exploited. They were victims to be protected, human beings deserving of basic care. A fleet of clean military transport trucks idled nearby. As they slowly, tentatively began to file out of the barracks, their fear still tangible, they saw the medic quietly distributing tiny chocolate bars. These were tiny, incomprehensible acts of grace. The officer directed them toward the lead truck. Before climbing up, they paused, looking back at the smoldering compound, the place where they had lost their youth and almost their souls. The memory was a chain they knew they would carry forever, but now, a small key had appeared, the terrifying possibility of hope. You need to know the next twist. Subscribe and comment where you watch. They climbed onto the truck, the rough canvas of the seats feeling like velvet. The engine roared to life, and as they pulled away, heading into a future more unknown and terrifying than the past they had just escaped, they clutched the water bottle and the image of the kind, silent medic. Their journey had only just begun. The air on the open truck was the freshest they had breathed in years, yet the freedom felt like a phantom limb, present but numb. They sat on the rough, canvas-covered benches, a row of silent, identical figures, each mind a fortress built on fear. The vehicle moved quickly, kicking up dust on the unpaved roads outside Manila. They clung to each other, not for comfort, but for the familiar friction of shared terror. Their journey was not a liberation, it was merely a transfer. They had only traded one set of walls for a moving cage. They watched the world outside through the gaps in the canvas, a blur of war-torn streets, skeletal buildings, and the unfamiliar sight of local people moving freely. The contrast was dizzying. Their old world was the compound, this new world was chaos under an alien flag. They saw American military jeeps, their drivers whistling tunes they couldn't place. This casual, loud ease of the American soldiers was perhaps the most frightening thing of all, the arrogance of people who had never known true powerlessness. The officer sat in a cab, his back to them, a monument of American indifference. Only the medic, the young man who had offered the chocolate, occasionally glanced back. When he did, he didn't pity them, he simply observed, his expression respectful but distant. They distrusted his kindness most of all. Kindness had always been the bait. The truck left the rubble behind, driving onto paved roads. The landscape began to change, the bombed-out wreckage giving way to sprawling, intact suburbs, an unsettling pocket of American life transplanted onto Asian soil. If you want to know where they are going, subscribe now. They passed signs they couldn't read, large, brightly painted billboards advertising products they could no longer imagine using. The sight of a smiling, clean American woman advertising toothpaste made one of them gasp. It was a ghost from a life they had forgotten. They realized their faces must still be blank, their clothes thin and dirty. The world saw the past on them. The collective silence of the women was occasionally broken by a dry cough or the sound of shifting weight, but never words. They didn't dare speak Japanese, they had been conditioned to believe their language was a weapon that could bring swift punishment. They communicated only through touch, a reassuring squeeze of a hand, a silent lean of a shoulder. The medic had given them water bottles, and they drank sparingly, rationing the clean liquid as if it were their last supply. After what felt like an eternity, the truck slowed. They could hear the sounds of traffic and ordinary city noise, a profound sensory assault after the suffocating quiet of the compound. The vehicle turned sharply and stopped. They braced themselves. This was it. The transfer point. They expected barbed wire, high walls, watchtowers. They expected an armed guard to haul them out. Instead, the officer opened the back of the truck, letting in the full glare of the late afternoon sun. He stood aside, gesturing for them to descend. The medic helped the older women down gently, careful not to initiate contact, but ready to steady them if they faltered. They found themselves not at a prison, but on a wide, beautifully maintained street. On one side stood a row of massive, immaculate mansions, part of a secure, American residential enclave. On the other side, across a manicured lawn, stood a building that defied all their expectations. It was large, built of pale stone, with sweeping, polished glass windows and bright, inviting lighting visible inside. There was no guard tower, no fence. Only a massive, decorative wrought iron gate that stood wide open, guarded only by a sense of order. They looked at the building, then back at the officer, confusion replacing fear. They refused to move beyond the immediate shadow of the truck. This was a sophisticated trap, they concluded. This grandeur was meant to disorient them before the real captivity began. The silence of their resistance was absolute. The officer sighed, his patience clearly strained by the cultural barrier. He spoke to the medic, who then stepped forward, his respectful gaze sweeping over their faces. "This is a place of rest," the medic translated slowly. "Not a camp. Inside, there are people who will help you. They want you to feel safe. They want you to look healthy." A murmur ran through the women. Healthy. That was a word that applied to crops and livestock, not to broken human beings. What was the purpose of this deception? To make them presentable for what new horror? The officer, sensing their continued fear, pointed to the large building. "It is a beauty salon," the medic translated, and the phrase caused a collective wave of disbelief. A beauty salon? They exchanged incredulous looks. It was the most bizarre, illogical command they had ever received. To care about their appearance when their humanity had been stripped bare seemed like a cruel joke, a profound misunderstanding of their suffering. One of the older women, still holding the canteen, looked directly at the medic, her eyes burning with confusion. The medic did not flinch. He simply repeated the instruction, his voice gentle but firm. "It is the first step. They want you to choose what you look like again." The idea was revolutionary, terrifying, and completely unbelievable. To choose. They didn't know how to choose. They only knew how to obey. They stood there, motionless, caught between the terrifying familiarity of their trauma and the shocking, unbelievable possibility of dignity. Don't miss the unbelievable twist. Subscribe now. Finally, the youngest among them, the one who had first walked into the sunlight, took a breath. She looked from the opulent building to the stern, waiting officer, and then she took a single, small step away from the truck. The others watched her, their collective fate hanging on her next move. The walk from the truck to the building was a paralyzing act of faith. They moved as a single, trembling unit, the youngest among them setting the slow, hesitant pace. Every instinct screamed that the luxury surrounding them was a threat more refined than barbed wire. The immaculate stone building, the sheer glass walls reflecting the bright afternoon sun, and the pervasive scent of foreign floral perfume, it all felt like the elaborate set design for a tragedy. They expected a concealed door to swing open, leading down to a dank basement. Instead, they were ushered into a space flooded with light and noise. This was the beauty salon. It was a chaotic, bustling world of American women and local staff, all dressed in clean, bright uniforms, moving with an astonishing, carefree purpose. They saw rows of plush chairs, mirrors stretching floor to ceiling, and tools they couldn't identify, strange curling irons, powerful dryers, and bottles of shimmering liquids. The sound was a loud, cheerful symphony of foreign voices, and the high-pitched whir of machinery, a direct assault on the silent world they had inhabited. The officer, clearly exasperated by their paralysis, spoke to the medic, who then stepped forward to interpret. "They are here to wash you. To cut your hair. To give you clothes." The medic used gentle Japanese, but the women heard only the cadence of a command. A group of women in clean white uniforms approached them, smiling broadly, too brightly. Their eyes were kind, but their hands moved with the terrifying, confident approach of people who expected obedience. They recoiled as a unit. Being touched, especially by strangers, especially with the intent of changing their appearance, felt like the ultimate violation. The old instinct screamed, "Do not let them touch you." The officer and the medic observed their terror, and the officer made a subtle gesture. The stylist stopped instantly, stepping back several feet. The pause was crucial. It was the second time the Americans had honored their lack of consent. The offer was a command, but refusing it did not bring immediate violence. The medic explained, "The officer says this is not mandatory. But they believe it is important. This is about your dignity. They want to remove the dirt from the compound." One of the older women, her eyes hard with years of silent resistance, spoke in a low, trembling voice. "Why do you care what we look like? This is a preparation for something else. A display." The medic didn't try to argue. He simply pointed to the mirrors. "Look at yourselves. This is the last time you will see yourselves as prisoners. The cleaning is for your own health. The new clothes are a choice. You can say no." The challenge was profound. They hadn't looked into a proper mirror in years, only at dark reflections in rusty metal or standing water. They slowly turned their gaze to the huge, glittering surfaces. They saw them, a line of spectral figures in rags, their hair matted and thin, their faces hollow, their eyes too old for their bodies. The image was devastating. It wasn't the reflection of a person, it was the shadow of an experience. Driven by a desperate, shared need to bury that image forever, they finally moved. One by one, they allowed themselves to be led to the chairs. The first ritual was the hair wash. The feeling of warm, running water over their scalps was a physical shock that triggered uncontrollable weeping in some. The scent of the shampoo, heavy with lemon and flowers, was so alien, so deeply connected to comfort they had forgotten, that it felt like an anesthetic being poured directly onto their wounds. The stylists, many of whom were local women who had witnessed the horrors of the war, worked in complete silence, their movements gentle, their faces masks of profound empathy. They simply treated the women as clients, not casualties. They restored their hair without comment, without judgment. The world is about to witness their transformation. Subscribe now. Then came the chairs. They sat stiffly, staring at their reflections, unable to connect the person in the mirror with the woman they remembered. The stylist working on the strongest one, the one who had walked first, picked up a pair of shears. She looked at the woman's ragged ends, then looked into her eyes, seeking permission without language. The woman nodded, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. The soft snip of the scissors was the sound of a chain breaking. With every cut of the stylist's hands, years of trauma, filth, and violation were falling away, dropping onto the pristine tiled floor like severed history. It was a terrifying act of self-reclamation. The women watched as the reflection in the mirror slowly began to change. The prisoner was being overridden. The biggest shock was the makeup. The stylists didn't attempt to make them look like glamorous American ladies. Instead, they focused on minimizing the dark shadows under their eyes and restoring some natural color to their pallid lips. When the process was complete, the women in the chairs looked like people. They looked healthy, clean, and recognizable as women who belonged in the world. They stood up, feeling impossibly light in the new, simple cotton dresses provided. They looked at each other, a collective gasp of profound realization passing between them. They had not been beautified, they had been rehumanized. The new reflection gave them the courage to look forward, not back. It was a terrifying form of power, the ability to walk out and choose to leave the visible evidence of their suffering behind. The medic and the officer waited near the exit. The officer, typically stern, allowed a faint flicker of relief to cross his face. He gestured toward a simple dining area adjacent to the salon. "Dinner," the medic translated. "A proper meal. You can sit as long as you like. No one will rush you." The journey from the compound to the dining room was the longest road they would ever travel. They carried their new clothes, their clean faces, and their overwhelming sense of hope mixed with profound fear. They knew the next test was coming. The trauma was buried, but the scars remained, and they were about to confront the terrifying reality of freedom. Don't miss the next chapter of their survival. Subscribe now. They filed into the room, their eyes scanning for the trap, but found only tables covered in white cloths, set with clean silverware and plates of simple, nourishing food. They hesitated at the threshold, unable to take that final step into a life of genuine dignity. The dining room was a blinding expanse of white linen, silver cutlery, and silence. They stood at the threshold, their new cotton dresses feeling like uniforms in this unfamiliar theater of normal life. The contrast between their clean, newly sculpted reflections and the shattered people beneath was unbearable. They were no longer victims defined by their rags, but their souls hadn't caught up to the transformation. The sight of the food, steaming bowls of rice, vegetables, and meat, should have been a comfort, but it was a terrifying test of freedom. Every fiber of their being was conditioned to scarcity, to a scramble, to the necessity of hoarding and obeying. Here, they were expected to sit, to serve themselves, to eat slowly. This simple act of self-determination was overwhelming. They filed to the tables, their movements stiff and unnatural, and sat down. The officer and the medic stood at a respectful distance, allowing them privacy. This deliberate separation was itself a form of shock. They were used to being observed, scrutinized, and controlled at all times. This space, this permission to exist without immediate supervision, felt vast and treacherous. The medic finally approached, carrying a tray of small, brightly colored fruits. He placed the tray in the center of the table and spoke through a translator. "Please. There is enough. Eat what you like. Eat what you like." The phrase was revolutionary. They hesitated, hands hovering over the utensils. One woman finally reached for a spoon, her hand shaking so violently the metal rattled against the ceramic bowl. She served herself a minuscule portion of rice, a habit ingrained by starvation. The others followed suit, creating a circle of meager portions on their large plates. The youngest among them, the one who had walked first, tried to bring a spoonful of food to her mouth. It was a failure. The trauma, the years of forced, desperate consumption, rose in a sickening wave. She began to weep, silently at first, then with shuddering intensity. The sound was immediately contagious. Soon, several others were weeping, the food untouched, their despair fueled by the agonizing realization of what they had lost, not just their dignity, but the simple, peaceful capacity to sustain themselves. The medic stepped closer, his face etched with genuine compassion. He pulled a small notebook and pen from his pocket. He didn't offer food or comfort, he offered an instruction. He spoke through the translator, his voice quiet. "When you are ready to speak, write it down. Your memories are important. Your stories must be kept safe." This was the biggest twist yet. The American didn't want their bodies, he wanted their truth. He wanted proof. They stared at the journal, a blank slate for the horrors they carried. It was a terrifying act of self-exposure. To write their stories down meant admitting they had happened, giving them permanence. The officer returned, his presence demanding respect. He had news. The medic translated that the Japanese command structure responsible for their compound had been detained. They were being processed for trial. There was no victory cheer among the women, only a cold, grim satisfaction. Justice was an abstract concept. It wouldn't bring back the years they had lost. If you want to witness true justice, you must subscribe now. Later that evening, after the disastrous attempt at dinner, they were led to a separate annex, a dormitory with clean, soft beds, fresh sheets, and quiet privacy. The simple luxury was deeply unsettling. They spent the first hour testing the mattresses, running their hands over the blankets, half expecting the beds to retract into traps. One of the older women, still holding the canteen from the truck, finally sat on the edge of her bed. She pulled the medic's notebook from her new dress pocket. She didn't write. Instead, she slowly turned the pages, inhaling the scent of the fresh paper. It smelled like possibility. The women gathered around her, their faces illuminated by a single kerosene lamp left by the medic. In the compound, they had shared everything: pain, fear, silence. Now, they shared this fragile space of tentative hope. They began to communicate again, not in full sentences, but in whispers, using the familiar, rhythmic language of their childhoods. They spoke of the smell of their mothers' homes, the sound of the ocean, the dresses they wore before the war. They were exchanging fragments of their former selves, piecing together a collective identity that had been brutally scattered. They realized the freedom they had been given was not a gift of ease, but a burden of choice. They could choose to look forward, but they would have to face their past first. The night passed in a series of starts and stops. They took turns watching the door, remnants of their conditioning overriding the evidence of their safety. As dawn approached, the strongest woman finally picked up the pen the medic had provided. She looked at the blank page for a long, agonizing moment. She didn't write about the compound. She wrote a single word, her hand shaky but determined: mother. It was the first step toward reclaiming their voice. Don't miss the next twist in their survival. Subscribe now. They knew their journey was far from over. They had cleaned their bodies, but the deep, internal scars of their captivity remained. They were clean, they were safe, but they had to decide what to do with the terrifying, vast unknown of their future. Dawn was a quiet, heavy presence in the clean dormitory. The women woke not to the clang of a metal door or the shout of a guard, but to the gentle, persistent sound of birdsong, a sound they had not realized they had forgotten. They rose from their soft beds, the absence of pain and terror in their surroundings feeling both miraculous and deeply unsettling. The night had been restless, a shared battle against the ghosts of their past, but the new morning offered a blank page. The woman who had written the word mother on the medic's notebook sat by the window. She held the notebook open, not daring to write more, but drawing strength from the single, powerful word. The others gathered around her, silently acknowledging that this small act of defiance, reclaiming a relationship that had been shamed and severed, was the first step toward reclaiming themselves. Their first task of the morning was to meet the officer and the medic. They gathered in the simple dining hall, the rice and vegetables on their plates this time met with a quiet, determined resolve. They ate slowly, consciously savoring the freedom of a meal that was not a fight. The officer entered with a translator, his demeanor softened by a night of reflection. He spoke clearly, delivering the necessary, cold news of the legal world. The officers who ran the compound were now prisoners themselves, facing trials for war crimes. The news was met with silence, not celebration. Justice was a necessary transaction, but it held no warmth. It did not heal. Then came the true challenge, the hard choice. The medic translated the options. You have been liberated. Now you must decide where you belong. They had three paths. First, they could return home to their families in Japan. The officer warned this was the most dangerous choice, as many families and communities might reject them due to the intense social shame associated with their history. Second, they could be sponsored to travel to a new country, America, Australia, or places in South America, to begin a new life far from the war and the memory of their trauma. Third, they could remain in the transition facility until they felt stronger, receiving care and rehabilitation. The words hung in the air, heavy with responsibility. To choose Japan meant confronting the very culture that had both permitted and inflicted their suffering. To choose America meant stepping into a world they didn't understand, alone. To choose to stay meant delaying the inevitable. They retreated to their room to debate. The conversation, carried out in quiet whispers, was the most important political discussion of their lives. We must go home, one older woman insisted, her voice trembling. Our ancestors. Our land. We cannot abandon them. But our mothers will turn away, another replied, the pain sharp in her voice. We carry a dishonor that is impossible to wash away. They will see only the camp, not the women who survived it. The strongest woman, the one with the notebook, looked down at the word mother. We are not dishonored. We were attacked. But if we go home, our stories will be silenced to protect the family name. This was the core dilemma. Survival meant choosing between their cultural roots and their personal truth. The consensus shifted slowly, painfully. They realized that the greatest threat to their recovery wasn't the shame of the past, but the silence of the future. If they went back to Japan, their stories would be buried. If they left, the world might finally hear them. They chose to leave. They chose the terrifying possibility of the unknown over the predictable cruelty of returning home. They would go to America. If you want to follow them to a new life, subscribe now. The preparation for departure was simple and swift. They were given travel documents, clean American-style civilian clothes, and a small purse containing currency. On their final morning at the facility, the medic came to their room one last time. He did not speak of the flight or the future. He handed the strongest woman a box, wrapped in simple brown paper. It was light. Inside, she found the notebook she had started, now much thicker. The medic had spent his nights painstakingly interviewing the others, filling the pages with their experiences, translating their memories into clear, concise English. He explained through the translator, "This is your history. It is translated and certified. When you arrive in the new country, you will have proof. You will have a voice." This was the final, devastating act of grace. The American had given them not just freedom, but validation. He had ensured their trauma would not be dismissed as rumor or myth. The women wept again, this time tears of profound gratitude and overwhelming hope. Their story was safe. They walked out of the facility and onto the street where the truck had first stopped. Now, a military vehicle waited to take them to the airport. They looked back at the large, pale building, the beauty salon, the hall of mirrors. It was no longer a symbol of dread, but a symbol of their resurrection. At the airport, the air was cold and noisy. The sounds of planes taking off and landing were deafening, but they were the sounds of movement, of going somewhere. They boarded the military transport plane, which would take them to a major military hub before connecting to a flight to the continental United States. As the plane taxied, the women looked out the small windows, watching the land shrink beneath them. They saw the remnants of the war, the scars on the land, and the hazy horizon of their old life receding. They were leaving behind the only world they had known, walking away from their families, their culture, and their painful memories. The strongest woman reached across the aisle and grasped the hand of the woman next to her. They held tight, not needing words. They were survivors. They had lost everything, but they had found each other, and in their shared truth, they had found a terrifying new kind of strength. They knew the journey ahead would be difficult. They would face language barriers, cultural shock, and the persistent internal burden of their past. But they had the notebook, they had their new names, and they had the unbreakable bond of shared trauma and shared hope. They would not be silenced. They were not victims anymore. They were witnesses. As the plane lifted off the runway, the world tilting beneath them, the final thought passed through their collective consciousness: we choose to live. Don't miss a single part of their new journey. Subscribe now.